It could be a scene from the streets of San Francisco, but the police yelp siren is the new sound in Gloucestershire.
Well, I had no problem at all in hearing it, that's definitely for sure. It just sounded like something from Starsky and Hutch.
In the 60s, alarm bells were ringing for people who wouldn't think twice about having one for the road, not to mention 2 or 3.
In 1967, Labour Transport Minister Barbara Castle struck fear into the hearts of drivers who like to tipple by introducing a little bit of kit developed in the 50s in America, the breathalyzer. With fatalities on the road increasing, not everyone welcomed this innovation with open arms. Graham Arnold, a sales director with the Lotus Sports Car Company, formed an action group with other businessmen to protect what they believed were their basic human rights.
Now, what do you mean by this? Basic principles of British freedom?
Well, it's a high-sounding phrase, but I think you'll agree that if a policeman knocks on your door and wants to search your house, he can't do so without a search warrant or very reasonable grounds for coming in. Now, they can stop you by the side of the road and demand to know the contents of your stomach.
Now to deal with the practical application with regard to the Alka test.
Like it or not, a law was introduced. Forces up and down the country were taught how to use the breathalyzer. Not a bad little number for the copper doing the training.
Now to give you the practical demonstration.
I remember early in my service bringing someone in, and I remember the cynical old police officers being a bit sort of aggressive towards me because they saw the breath test as a step backwards for people. You know, there was sort of off-the-cuff comments thrown, like, you know, the guy was only enjoying himself, you know. My response to that was, yeah, but the guy has just crashed his car into the back of someone else's car, you know.
In police work, there are always funny stories. One was a guy who had crashed his car into the top of the roundabout, and we arrived just after it happened, and he got out and he said, "It's all right, officers." He said, "I've just parked it for the night."
Having failed a breath test, back at the nick, the driver would then be asked to give a sample of blood or urine.
And this guy's actually holding a container and urinating into it when he suddenly stops and drinks it. And as he's drinking it, it's still coming out the bottom end, and it looked as though it was going from top, right through to bottom. And the traffic officer, who was a very laid-back guy, said as quick as a flash, "You're supposed to give the piss, not take it."
It might have left a bad taste in the mouth for some, but in the first year the breathalyzer was introduced, deaths on the road dropped by over 1,000.
Coming up, when some of Britain's streets were like battlefields, coppers had to grab whatever they could to defend themselves. And mayhem, when a hostage crisis goes out of control. In post-war Britain, policing was changing fast. Even the police dog was having to learn new tricks.
Since the war, dogs have been making up for the shortage of manpower, and you must agree they make fair crops.
Police dogs and their handlers formed very close bonds.
Fagin was my dog. He was my right arm. He was 8 stone, built like a small bison, and he had a bite like a crocodile. And you spend 8 or 9 hours together, and I would have conversations with him. I'd quite regularly find myself chatting to him, and I loved it.
The police dog had a serious role to play in crime prevention, though they weren't always great for your best furniture.
Where is it? Good boy. How easy has it been to train this dog, sir?
Very difficult indeed. The dogs find the smell of the explosive an unpleasant one, whereas with the narcotic substances, I enjoy doing the work.
I wonder why.
One daring idea from Oxford Police in 1963 planned to take the dogfight to the skies. Dog handler Peter Cottrell and his faithful friend Danko signed up for the rigorous and highly specialised training.
It wasn't very difficult. I'd love to sort of flannel everybody off and say, oh, well, bloody difficult. I mean, one of the trouble in modern life is that you always have to make things seem difficult. If you do something, you'll say, oh, well, it's damn difficult to do, you know, but often it isn't.
The hardest task was holding Danko back from the bad guys.
I'm sure that if I'd have let him go at 300 feet, he would have jumped out and done it anyway.
After spending weeks perfecting this daredevil airborne dog unit, there was one slight drawback.
It had no practical usage. You know, major criminals, you know, they don't run across fields. They sort of, they do all sorts of things and get away in fast cars.
It wasn't just man's best friend enlisted in the fight against crime. The 1960s wasn't all flower power and peace, man. Revolution was in the air.
Men of the mounted branch of the Metropolitan Police, one of the familiar sights of the streets of London.
More and more, the police were calling in the cavalry. In 1960, Sidney Lutz was a red-blooded young recruit looking for excitement and adventure.
I used to love the girls. And I was out one day and I saw a mounted policeman talking to a young lady, and he's got his pocketbook out and he wrote something down in his pocketbook. And after the young lady had walked off, I said to him, "What have you summoned her for?" He said, "I haven't reported her for anything." He said, "I've just chatted her up." He said, "I've taken her telephone number." And I thought to myself, that's the job for me.
By the turn of the 70s, the police still hadn't updated their equipment or training methods.
Everything we did was exactly the same as what Wellington's troops and the Prince Regent's troops were doing down at Brighton centuries before. We had no protective gear whatsoever. We turned up for demonstrations in the same uniforms as we did our daily patrol.
At least the mounted police had around half a ton of horseflesh beneath them.
We used to get very upset if we heard that foot duty PCs were being injured.
The boys on the beat had no more than a truncheon, helmet and good health insurance.
And in those days, we had no body armour, we had no shields, we just sort of linked arms bravely together and hoped that our helmets wouldn't fall off.
It's still the traditional sort of personal hand-to-hand fight.
Health and safety, that was, I don't think it was considered in those days.
If coppers wanted extra protection, they had to use their own initiative.
For protection, they used to wear football shin pads, which you'd slip inside your socks.
It was every policeman's duty to protect the crown jewels.
We were all encouraged to get the cricket boxes. I don't think you've ever seen those, but we eventually ended up by getting one sent from a friend of mine who lived in Southend. Always had gloves, that was important. You had a truncheon with you.
You didn't think about whether you were well managed. In fact, I don't think management was a term that was that yet found its way into modern policing. It was about, you stand there, you link arms with him, and when you can go, I'll tell you.
This unit is going to cordon the space in an orderly way. The inspector should station himself behind the cordon.
The preferred tactics of police chiefs for crowd control weren't exactly contemporary. They'd first been used by the Romans 2,000 years ago.
The men on the sides of the wedge link arms, and the whole formation moves forward in step through the cordon and into the crowd. Note the trudge step.
The wedge and the trudge. Well, that was all very well if you were carrying spears or guns or knives or whatever. It might have some impact, but just to put unarmed officers to walk through and trudge through as one sort of step, looking like the mummy.